There are a number of cultural factors that influence how students and instructors will communicate in a multicultural academic environment. In this program, Dr. Nanda Dimitrov of the University of Western Ontario in London, Ontario, shares with us her experiences in working with students and faculty from a variety of cultures and how intercultural communication and collaboration is essential in today's global learning environments.
When international students join a new academic environment, there are a number of cultural factors that influence how they communicate both with faculty members and with other students in that learning environment. And essentially, they have to learn another academic culture. They come from a culture of their own, that's their ethnic culture, but the academic culture in their home country, whether that's Nigeria or China or India, is very different from academic culture in the UK or Canada. And there are different rules about how to appropriately write a paper, critique the ideas of others, or participate in a class discussion, whether online or face-to-face. And so when students join this new academic culture, they have to learn a different set of rules. And there's a chance that there might be some misunderstandings with the faculty members with whom they're communicating. And so some of the major differences that influence how they interact include, for example, differences in power distance. In many cultures, faculty members hold much higher status than the students, whereas in British or Canadian culture, we're fairly informal. In the US even more, and there's less of a power difference between a faculty member and a student. So in a high power distance culture, our Nigerian and Indian students tell us that their professors would never say, "I don't know," if they asked a question. It is just unacceptable. The professor would lose face. In Chinese culture, students will not interrupt the professor or will not ask a question that could suggest that the professor didn't do a good job explaining, because that could cause them to lose face. So again, they're very mindful of the power difference, and it's something that they have to get used to. The ability to more freely approach faculty members and the expectation to approach them frequently and ask questions and critique ideas in class are one of the things that they often need to learn about when they come to another culture. There's a major cultural difference that's referred to as the difference between high and low context cultures. This concept originally comes from anthropologist Edward T. Hall, and it basically refers to whose responsibilities to understand the message that is given in a teaching environment or other environment. So what happens is, in North American culture is what we call a low context culture. Here, it's a responsibility of the speaker to make sure that the message is understood. So the faculty member has to make sure, the instructor has to make sure that they give all the information necessary for the students to be able to do what they need to do in class. And this is why our directions in learning environments tend to be very, very specific and very, very detailed. Sometimes we give 3-page instructions for a 5-page paper because we talk about the size of the margins, what citation style we expect from our students, give examples of how to write, how to do research, and so on. Edward T. Hall refers to this as over-explaining. We're very detailed. We try to avoid lawsuits. We want to be very, very clear in our communication because it's all our responsibility. Whereas our students from high context cultures such as China, Korea, or Japan feel like we're over-explaining and sometimes insulting them by giving too much detail. Because in their culture, it is to a greater extent the listener's responsibility to figure out what is being said. So students work a lot harder with the professor to try to understand what's happening and what the message is, and bring in contextual information, things that were said last class, issues that were in the readings. And the prof might not be expected to be as explicit as they are in, let's say, Canadian culture. So that influenced relationships the other way too. So a student from a high context culture like Japan might walk into a professor's office and try to ask for a letter of reference. They would not make that request very directly. A Canadian student might walk into someone's office and say, "Hello, Professor Smith, I'm ready to apply for jobs, and would you be able to support me with a letter of reference?" It's very clear, very direct. A student from a high context culture might have a fairly long conversation for a while, dance around the point, establish some trust, make sure that the professor is comfortable with them and they remember what class they have taken and so on. And then they might try to hint, and they might say, well, I've been looking at some jobs. Here are some companies I've been considering. But they will not actually go out and directly say, I'd really like you to write me a letter of reference. But they might expect the instructor to figure that out, because they don't want to ask directly, just in case they put the instructor in the uncomfortable position that they can't do it. And then they would have to say no. And that would be really uncomfortable in their culture and interfere with interpersonal harmony. So they will dance around the point, and the instructor, who might be from a low-context culture, is sitting there thinking, what on earth does this student want? They've been sitting in my office for half an hour. I'd really like to help them, but I really don't know. So unless they know what questions to ask to clarify, so what I'm hearing is that you're applying for jobs and you might need a letter of reference. Do you think I could help you with that? Communication might break down, and one might walk out of the office thinking, I didn't get what I wanted, I didn't get quite heard. So that's one cultural difference that we find influences communication a lot. It impacts online interaction as well. I get a lot of very high context emails from students who write to me and say, hi, I'd like to know more about your program. Thank you sincerely. And I have to write back and say, thank you for your interest, but we have a large number of programs. Tell me what's your discipline. Tell me more about what you're here to study. I'll be happy to recommend programs, but I need a lot more information. And so we negotiate how much information each of us needs to be able to have that interaction, because without the appropriate amount of context, I don't know what they want, and I'd like to help them. And I need to adjust to them, and they need to adjust to me, and we need to negotiate halfway. One of the other things that differs across cultures in how students and faculty communicate is how we express our ideas and how we write. In American and Canadian culture, we tend to be fairly direct and very linear in the way we express ourselves. And students are expected to bring in new knowledge, especially in graduate school, construct new knowledge during their graduate program, and critique the ideas of authors. And that's something that students, for example, from Confucian educational cultures are very uncomfortable with. Because in their culture, changing the words of a great author is extremely disrespectful. So you might restate, a student from China might restate the ideas of a great author, but not change them. And sometimes they run into difficulties with academic integrity rules at our universities until they understand that it's okay to critique someone's ideas and rephrase them. Or similarly in India, in the Indian writing style, students might restate obviously known truths rather than, and hope that this leads to new discussion in class, as opposed to bringing in new ideas, because it's just a start. So I remember going to a conference a few years ago where a scholar from India gave a presentation. It was a political science conference. And the gist of the message was population growth is a huge issue. And it is going to be a huge issue. And a lot of Westerners in the audience walked away thinking, well, I didn't learn anything new. But it was the start of a discussion afterwards of new ideas. But it was simply a different way of approaching writing and constructing knowledge that came from Indian academic culture. And it was very different from what we try to do at other institutions with different academic cultures. Other cultural differences that influence the interaction between students and faculty is how we give feedback. But essentially, in some cultures, feedback is very, very direct to the student, and it's acceptable for it to be quite negative, and students are used to hearing negative feedback, whereas in Canadian culture we tend to be very polite and give feedback as a feedback sandwich. We give positive feedback, then we sort of provide some constructive criticism of the students' ideas, and then we end on a very positive note again, making sure that they know that they're doing a great job, they're progressing great. So a student from a culture such as French culture or Belarusian culture who's used to fairly direct negative feedback might not hear that message and feel like, well, I got 2 positives and 1 negative. I don't really need to do anything. So sometimes we might need to adjust our ways of giving feedback to students in different cultures. And similarly, in Chinese culture, for example, what's very slightly negative and constructive feedback for us might sound extremely negative to a student from Chinese culture for whom it feels like they're losing face when they're receiving negative feedback. Another issue that influences student-faculty interaction is how both sides perceive the role of the student and the role of the faculty member, and how much initiative is expected from each side. So in high-power distance cultures, the professor is expected to take most of the initiative. So our students from Egypt tell us that when they come to a Canadian university, they expect the professor to tell them what to do research on, what their project will be, to provide the funding, and direct them at each step, because that's what their supervisors have done back home. Whereas their Canadian supervisors expect a lot more independence from them. They promote inquiry-based and self-directed learning, and they can say, well, look around and choose a topic, think about what might work for your career, let me know what you want to work on, I'll support you in that. And the students are not comfortable with that sense of independence, or it takes them a while to figure out how much independence they can have, and when they need to ask questions, and what types of issues they can make decisions about. And so that's a question that faculty and students need to discuss before they start a supervisory relationship particularly, or any sort of learning relationship, of where does initiative come from, and how much does the student and how much does the professor set the direction of learning in graduate school, where there's a lot greater degree of independence expected. So one of the issues that helps faculty to be aware of while they're working with international students is that often there's a big gap between students' speaking and writing ability. So you will find some students who learned ESL from written sources, whose written English will be excellent and outstanding, and they can write publishable articles and are extremely eloquent in their writing, but have extreme difficulty with public speaking or making presentations. And at the same time, you might find students from an oral culture where they're very, very fluent in their spoken language, but have great difficulty writing because they might be from a technical discipline where they haven't had the opportunity to write in English, so they're not familiar with writing conventions in the host culture wherever they're moving to. So one of the reasons why it's helpful to be aware of this is because when there's a big gap between the two, faculty tend to be suspicious and they wonder whether the writing is the student's own. And often it is. Students learn the words from the dictionary, from the books, and they are very formal and eloquent in their writing. But it's not reflected in their speaking ability. So holding off judgment until one has had a chance to see the students write, or design assignments that allow them to hand in drafts of their writing while they're working, is usually helpful. Because this academic integrity is an area where there's a lot of misunderstanding between faculty and students, particularly in face-to-face learning environments. Perhaps less so online. The second issue that helps both students and faculty in their interactions is cultural differences in feedback. And so Lionel LaRoche, a scholar in Canada who looks at cultural diversity in the technical professions, has created a model that looks at feedback as a continuum. So if you think about feedback on a continuum from positive to negative, with neutral in the middle, slightly negative to one side, slightly positive to one side, and so on, extending. There are cultural differences in how wide the slightly negative and the very negative feedback zones are for everyone. So the implications of this for cross-cultural communication between students and faculty are that I might be giving slightly negative feedback to a student from the Middle East, and what's slightly negative for me, constructive, saying you really need to write that second chapter because your hypotheses are not entirely clear, but overall you did a fairly good job and you're kind of on the right track, but I need you to work on this. For the student, this might fall entirely in their neutral zone, because in order for them to hear this message, it needs to be a lot louder, a lot stronger for it to fall into their negative zone. So faculty need to think about they might need to change the message if they feel like it's not heard, or they might need to tone down the message if the student hears it much more negatively than they intended it to. So for example, if I say to a Chinese student, well, the article you wrote is a good start, but you really need to work on your writing, so I would recommend that you take a graduate level writing course, because in this current state, this article is not really publishable, but I really want you to be able to publish it. So please take this writing class and then come back and show me the draft in a couple of months. So on hearing this feedback, the student might go away and think, oh, my professor doesn't think my writing is good enough to get published. So maybe what they're really trying to say is that I'm not ready for graduate school and I should quit. And that wasn't the intended message. The intended message was, you're doing great, but you need to work on it a little bit more. Whereas on the student's feedback scale, it was much more negative than how I intended it to. So Lionel LaRoche's work has been really useful to us in our work with both supervisors and students when there's conflict in how they hear each other. And showing them the scale often helps us mediate those cultural differences and mediate the conflicts that they might have with each other. So it's important for students to think about what they can do to prepare before they get to our graduate program in another country, before they start, in order to succeed. So what we've seen from successful students is that they ask a lot of questions. They try to understand the academic culture of both the discipline that they're joining and the university that they're joining, because both of them are unique. So we try to encourage them to conduct almost like a mini ethnography of their discipline, and to try to find out what it takes to be a good scholar in biology or engineering or education, and to try to figure out the unspoken rules of the discipline. And they can do that by talking to other graduate students and asking questions about their experience, by sitting down with their faculty member and just to say, what are your expectations for me as a student, for my role? What do I need to do to succeed? And what is your role? And they need to talk about issues like, so how do you know if I'm having trouble? Or how do you know when I'm succeeding? There was an interesting research in Australia a few years ago where they asked Australian supervisors what they thought was going on when their students didn't get in touch with them for a few months or a few weeks. And the supervisor said, well, if my student doesn't call me, I'm sure they're working hard on their research and everything's going really well. They must be working a lot. Whereas the students from Indonesia, who were from a high context culture and much more indirect, said, no, if I won't see you, if I avoid talking to you, that means something's really wrong and I'm not on the right track, but I don't know what to do. So in order to succeed, students need to talk to their supervisors about how often are they expected to meet, who comes up with the research question. They need to attend research talks at their university or read articles in the top journals to try to figure out how do scholars in their discipline walk the walk and talk the talk, what it takes to be a good scholar, and what are not only the types of technical skills that they need to learn in that discipline, on how to do a literature review or what types of methodologies to use, but also to find out what are the communication skills that are required from them to succeed in the discipline. So how to present a paper at a conference, how to write one, how to interact with others in a collaborative learning environment, whether it's in class, how much participation is expected. We've had students who haven't gone to see their professor for months and months and months because they didn't realize that that was an expectation, and they could have asked about that. A couple of things that faculty can do to help their students adapt to this new academic culture that they're just joining is articulating expectations very, very clearly of what will help students succeed in this new academic environment. So they can do this through orientation sessions. They can do this through giving good role model articles to their students. So if there's a student from China who's uncomfortable critiquing the ideas of great authors, they might give them the article of another Chinese author who has done that effectively. They can mentor their students by hooking them up with learning communities of other students. And they can also do that by simply sitting their students down and asking them, what helps you learn best? What helps you do your best? And what can I do to support and mentor you in this learning process? So another way in which faculty can support their students in the transition to a new academic culture is to promote initiative among them, to encourage them to bring questions to meetings, to ask for clarification, encourage them to come up with their own timeline or goals for the program. Those are often factors that influence the success of students, and often our international students come from cultures where they're expected to take less initiative and more direction from a supervisor than we expect them in either Canadian or American or British academic culture. And then finally, one of the other useful reminders is not to jump to conclusions about the meaning of student communication and not to attribute it to personality very quickly. Often, if we're not sure what the student is trying to say, or if we get an email that sounds harsh or hurried, or we attribute negative meaning to it, I try to stop myself and say, okay, I wonder what the student might have meant. Is there something in the context that I'm not aware of, and maybe because they're using a second language, they didn't mean what I think they're meaning. And even though English is my own second language too, even though I've spoken it for a long time, every once in a while I go to my native speaker colleagues and say, I got an email from so-and-so that I think means this. What do you think? And before I jump to conclusions about students criticizing me or being overly pushy and trying to get into my class, I check with my colleagues just to make sure that I understood what was meant accurately, and I didn't read too much into it. So in the online learning environment, cultural differences still influence communication, even though a large channel of communication, nonverbal behavior, is not present. Cultural differences very heavily influence nonverbal communication. So when students and faculty interact face-to-face, they also need to consider cultural differences in personal space, in touch, in eye contact, and gestures. And without these in the online environment, we still have a lot of cultural differences remaining that affect how we interact with each other. One of the big differences is time and how we perceive deadlines. So in courses, we would have a lot of interim and final deadlines for assignments. And in monochronic cultures that include Germany or Britain, Canada, and the US, deadlines tend to be fairly firm, and we adhere to them fairly religiously. Whereas students from Brazil, for example, that is a polychronic culture, or other Latin American cultures, might see deadlines as an objective to be achieved if possible, but ones that are fairly flexible. So for instructors, it would be useful to articulate how seriously they take deadlines and let the students know that they may or may not be negotiable, because there might be different cultural assumptions about how they play out and whether they are negotiable in this online learning environment. Even though a lot of online communication takes place asynchronously, another issue that comes up from time to time is how we take turns in conversation. So if there's an online discussion and students are contributing to this online discussion, how do you know when it's your turn to contribute? And we've had an interesting example from a West African culture where in an online learning course offered in Canada, some of the participants were from West African cultures, and the men participated in the discussion very happily, but there was a female participant who didn't write anything. And so the instructor noticed this and sent an email to the participants and said, I noticed that you didn't say anything. How can we help you learn? What is happening here? And she explained that in her culture, the women contribute when the men are done talking. And in the online environment, she was never sure when they were done. So, and she felt very uncomfortable interrupting because that would have been inappropriate in her culture. So the way they worked around this was the female participant sent her contributions to the instructor, and the instructor posted them on the online course discussion board. And this way they respected her needs for turn taking in her own culture, as well as her need to participate, because a lot of the grade was based on participation in the online discussion. Another interesting cultural difference that I've seen in action in an online environment is that some cultures use what we call circular reasoning. So they don't get straight to the point, but they might describe a story or approach the issue by sort of dancing around the point and starting from fairly far away. So we had a mature student in one of our courses who's a member of the Aboriginal culture, First Nations culture here in Ontario. And we were talking about higher education institutions and the goal of higher education, different pedagogies in our course. And one of the questions he posted online was, to everyone in the class, which of your grandmothers had the greatest influence on you? And our first reaction was, this is way off topic. Why are we talking about the influence of our grandmothers? But then it was fascinating because he started here with grandmothers, but then the discussion evolved and he brought it closer to how we learn and how our culture influences us and our learning styles, and how that influences the way we participate in higher education, how we bring that into the classroom environment. And it was a fascinating discussion that everyone enjoyed, and there were a number of students from cultures around the world in the class too. So just because the discussion starts far away from our topic seemingly, it might not be irrelevant, because for those cultures it's very relevant. It just takes a while to get through the topic. And a final factor to keep in mind in online learning is cultural differences in learning styles. In a number of cultures, it's valued if the writer takes a while to get to the point. I was originally born and raised in Hungary, and when I first came to the US as an international student, the feedback I got from my writing often said, this is too vague, I don't know what the point is, where you're going with this. And I soon realized that in my culture, we don't really articulate the thesis sentence at the beginning of the paper. And that's also true of French culture and a number of European cultures, because it's not seen as classy if you give away the main idea at the very beginning of the paper. So students from a number of cultures might write papers that sound like they're not as explicit as expected in, let's say, at an American university, where we start with a thesis sentence, then we elaborate on that, then we restate it again, and there's value in repetition. Whereas in that culture, what's valued is if you keep the suspense till the very end. So either in the contributions to an online discussion or in the papers that the students might submit, you might observe this cultural difference. And faculty would have to find ways to give feedback to the students and give them model papers and explain if they prefer a different type of writing style, and explain what their standards are for clarity in writing. Some of the things that doctoral students can do to support each other in an online learning environment is to share what they have learned about how they have succeeded in their particular discipline and what unspoken rules of the discipline they have figured out and understood. They can form their own learning community and share with each other what they have learned through attending conferences or talking to other scholars in the discipline. And they can also succeed by getting feedback. And sometimes that might be a difficult learning experience, but definitely very useful. We had a graduate student here at our university who interviewed for a faculty position at another university in Canada. He did not get the position, but he wanted to learn, so he asked for feedback through his supervisor to find out what he's done well and what he could do better if he went back for an interview, and to understand what he needed to do to succeed in becoming a scholar in this discipline. And the feedback he received was that during the interview, he failed dinner. And what they meant by that was that he was fantastic in his research, he was very eloquent in discussing what he studied, but he didn't realize that one of the unspoken norms of his discipline was that at a job interview, he had to present himself as a colleague, engage in conversations about topics outside of his own research. One of the tests of understanding your discipline and having the appropriate communication competence in that discipline is passing the interview and getting a job in the field, if that is the goal of someone's graduate education. So he found out in a challenging way, but a really useful way, that there were other communication skills that he had to complement his technical expertise with. And he could have learned that from other students who have gone on job interviews before him. He could have done some readings to find out what was expected. But at least he learned through feedback, which was very, very useful to him. Leadership varies across cultures too, but there's also a lot of common elements. So colleagues who are leaders in higher education often work to promote internationalization or globalization of learning, and they themselves need the intercultural competence to communicate not only across national cultures in their work, but across the cultures of disciplines, because each discipline has a unique disciplinary culture, and leadership requires an understanding of what is valued in the sciences or in education or in the social sciences and arts and humanities. So intercultural competence is a very important skill to develop for leaders. And because leaders often promote change and involve their constituents and their students in cultural learning, one of the things that is really crucial is for leaders in higher education to understand the risks that are involved in cultural learning for their students. Because cultural learning involves a lot of uncertainty, it involves a lot of self-disclosure, it involves a risk of embarrassment, a risk of a threat to one's identity, because when we learn another culture, we suddenly discover that our ways of doing things are not necessarily the only ways of doing things, and definitely not the right ways of doing things. And that change can be difficult. And so leaders need to be able to navigate resistance to cultural learning and to be aware of what are the stages of intercultural development as either they themselves or the people that they're working with, the stages of development that their learners are going through as they are going through culture change, and with transformative learning that happens along the whole process, whether we're taking a class of learners and study abroad or whether we're implementing culture change at a whole institution. So one of the models that we have found really useful in understanding that process is Milton Bennett's model of the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity that has stages that describe resistance to cultural learning, a stage of defense where we're threatened by difference that happens in every change process. It has a minimization stage where we focus on similarity rather than difference, and then it continues to other stages to acceptance and adaptation. And what I really like about this model is that it proposes tools for teaching and tools for learning, so leaders would find it useful in facilitating change at their universities or in their classrooms if they're internationalizing the curriculum or involving their students in other types of transformative learning processes.